Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Hall and everybody else, Rory, it's simply wonderful to see you again. I must apologise if we've kept you waiting a little, because we've had an amazing morning full of fantastic presentations on subjects dear to the heart of everybody alive, but a bit difficult for me given my years, basically digital transformation and then artificial intelligence. But I personally am hugely grateful to see, for the opportunity to see you again. And these few words of introduction are going to be very few, because we have already got you to put forward some of the subjects which you would like to talk about. These are include China and its role in the world, coups in Africa, the rise of populism, and what will be of special interest in this audience, the EU and the UK's role in it. Other subjects may emerge. One that is certainly of interest to me personally is the forthcoming publication of your new book, Politics on the Edge. If you had been here, I'd have badgered you for a signed copy of it, and I'm sure others would have done too, but we can't have everything. A word, perhaps, just to, before I leave the field to Rory, why am I here? Why am I moderator? The answer is that I have known Rory since his birth in Hong Kong 50 years ago. And the reason for that is that lies with Rory's father, Brian Stewart. Brian was a man who was not only determined that only the very best would do in preparation for Rory's future life and career, but for different reasons, we both admired, respected, and indeed loved him dearly. My reasons were bound up with the fact that he was my direct working boss on a number of occasions. And from him, I think I learnt more than anybody else that I've ever come across. As the years went by, he took me increasingly under his wing, to the extent that in later years he took to calling me a younger brother, which for Chinese aficionados, so you will understand, is a high compliment for which I don't deserve. But that's enough from me. You know that you've been described in today's programme as the Right Honourable Rory Stewart, OBE, President of Give Directly, host of The Rest Is Politics, and former Secretary of State for Development. You and I know, Rory, that this barely scratches the surface of your 1,000,001 other activities and achievements, but I'm going to stop there and hand over to you. The floor is yours. Are you still in Amman?
I've just made it back from Amman, and I'm about to set off again to the States.
Right.
Well, thank you all very much. And great honor to join Michael Thompson, who, those of you who don't know him, was one of the most distinguished Foreign Service officers of his generation, who started as a very active, very courageous young officer in Malaysia and in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, but then went on to be responsible for very, very difficult British operations across the world, including, in fact, running Africa, which for a large part of the British government. So very proud to be with him, and very proud also, as he says, that he was such a close friend of my father's. I'm going to talk relatively briefly and then hopefully bring in some questions, but I wanted to begin by framing where I see the world and how the state of the world today relates to what's happened since 1989. And broadly speaking, I think to understand where we are, particularly politically, we need to see the period since 1989 in three distinct phases. Phase one, 1989 to 2004, which I would call the age of the liberal global order. 2004 to 2014, I'd call the age of uncertainty, and the age of 2014 till today, which I would call the age of populism. Now, these kinds of historical characterizations are always simplifications, but it is very, very remarkable how different those ages are across a whole series of indicators and how quickly the world is changing. I mean, I think one of the themes that you've been touching on this morning is that we live in a world of the most rapid, unpredictable change. So 89 to 2004. This, of course, is the age after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where the United States is unchallenged and where a particular vision of liberal markets, of globalization, of democracy seems to be spreading at a very rapid rate around the world. It's a period where Francis Fukuyama famously talks about the end of history. So you get this sense that during that period, there is a very strong consensus, a consensus that we know how to do economics, and that comes through deregulation and globalization. We know how to think about democracies, which is basically an assumption that as you get more prosperous, you're naturally going to become a democracy, and that the US and its allies are going to help the world along this inevitable path. And indeed, during this period, there was a lot to be optimistic about. The number of world democracies in the world actually doubled in that period. The world got more prosperous. In Britain, for example, our GDP per capita for the first time in over a century was growing faster than that of the United States. Our productivity was the second highest in the developed world. In Bosnia and Kosovo, it seemed as though intervention was bringing peace and building states. And then we lurched into the second phase. And the second phase, the age of uncertainty, which really begins about 2004, is shaken by various events. The financial crisis shakes very hard our assumptions that we know how economies work. Instead, much of our economic structure becomes associated with inequality between countries and inequality within our own country. Productivity in Britain stagnates, doesn't take off again. Iraq and Afghanistan humiliates the idea of a liberal global order. And the rise of China calls into question the idea that there is a necessary connection between prosperity and democracy. And the rise of social media, Twitter and Facebook, of course, being founded in this period, begin to create an increasingly polarized politics. And that's the preface to what happens in 2014, which is the beginning of the age of populism. That's the year in which Narendra Modi is elected in India, and we move on quite quickly to the election of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Brexit referendum in Britain, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and of course, most dramatically of all in 2016, the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And we now find ourselves in a world in which figures like Donald Trump seem to persist, regardless of the number of times they are impeached or prosecuted. Figures like Marine Le Pen look like they are in pole position to take over from Macron in France, where the AfD is rising in Germany and in Sweden and in Finland and in Italy. We can see far-right parties coming into government. It's an age in which authoritarianism in Turkey and China and Russia is on the rise, and governments led by charismatic leaders with increasingly nationalist agendas are taking over. It's a period where the number of democracies in the world is falling quite steeply. We've seen 7 coups in sub-Saharan Africa in just over a year, in which populations feel for the first time in a long time that their children are going to be worse off than they were, in which trust in public institutions is very low, and in which even those bits of the liberal center that remain, figures like Joe Biden, United Kingdom, perhaps more moderate figures like Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, are increasingly withdrawing from the world. One indicator of that, when I was Secretary of State for International Development in 2019, I had a budget of, for Africa alone, bilateral budget of about $4.5 billion. and perhaps another $4 billion in multilateral spend in Africa. This year, the British government will spend probably 500 million, 1/8 of that amount, and that's just since 2019, that fall away. So this, of course, raises the question, what's the future? How does the Liberal centre respond to this populist challenge? How does it articulate an economic policy that's genuinely compelling and doesn't just sound like a lazy return to the 1990s? How do we deal with challenges such as AI and climate? How do we get global cooperation going again? But I think having laid out this sort of grand picture, I would love to involve you all more in the conversation. And I will stop speaking here to hand over to questions from the audience or from Michael. I'm happy to go in any direction.
Thank you very much, Rory. I should have perhaps just mentioned that this morning so far has been a mix of brilliant presentations on AI and on digital transformation, and a load of the sort of things we have to put up with, like a sudden fire alarm which got us all out of the building, and one or two snafus relating to this. But I don't want to say any more, except if it's not as smooth as it should be, there is some background for it. But ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours for whatever questions you like to ask Rory. James.
Well, from the outset, thanks, Rory, very much for joining us today. It's greatly appreciated. And being someone who knows Michael well, I can only fully underscore exactly every word that you have said with lots of pluses. So question is on your analysis, where we've been since through the international order from 1988 or was 1989 to 2004. Anyway, you've got three phases which are basically by decade. And it reminded me of a article which Niall Ferguson had written in the Sunday Times about 5 years ago, where he said, well, things tend to go by decades. That we see that in the first half of the decade, so 2015, 2020, we had the populism stuff. And so then his argument was that the rest of, well, the first half of this decade, which we're now in, will be Brexity, will be Trumpy and whatever else, but it'll be taken up by something else from 2025 onwards. So I think that although you're asking us maybe to participate, my question to you is, as you're thinking about these different ages, what is the age that we're now about to move into? It's obviously one which is going to have a huge disruptor called AI. That was our discussion just now. But equally, you're going to see the rise of people who will have new ideas, new generations, whatever, and with an immense ability to communicate amongst each other across the globe, which we've never had before. You see the example of ChatGPT, which was really not heard of 12 months ago, but it's suddenly internationally become a huge phenomenon. So if one's looking about wanting, as we do in the Ideas Network 2030, is to look beyond and seeing where we're headed over the next decade, the question for me then comes, what are these major factors that you see in the next decade coming, which will define what this age will be called? And it's about shaping the future and about involving people in creating this new decade, which I think is where my question comes to you. And it was just tempting as you had those three things. I thought about this decade analysis of Niall Ferguson, and so it begs the question, I guess. Not even, well, it's maybe at the end of our discussion we could call it the age of something, but maybe for the start off, what are the key factors which will be part of this decade in your view?
Well, I think the next age could be either an age of despair or an age of decentralization. And I think those are the two choices that we face. And why is that? Because I think that the key factors which will define the next decade are going to be, firstly, how do we, it's going to be a decade which will be by its nature more protectionist, less open to global free trade. It's going to be an era defined by more radical national security threats, in which the standoff between authoritarian states and democracies will become more dramatic, and in which AI will almost certainly lead to the shedding of a very large number of jobs. I mean, we'll end up I think, with double-digit unemployment in many countries. And social media and AI will continue to be deeply disruptive, undermining forces in politics. So the question really on whether the age is going to be an age of despair or an age of decentralization depends on how leaders in society respond to those trends. Led badly in the age of despair option, we will find governments unable to generate decent economic growth, who will retreat to the sort of protectionism and industrial strategies of the 1970s, creating extremely inefficient, centralized, bloated states with high taxation burdens, giving very little space to innovation or entrepreneurs. Managed badly, we will find a very large number of people unemployed who are not adequately retrained for the future. Managed badly, we will see increasing collapse in the number of democracies around the world, an increasing amount of violence and military rule as the West isolates itself more. Managed well, which is my age of decentralization, it would be an age where people spot these problems and they give power away. And they understand that the institutions that have currently been created are not well suited to micromanaging nations. It will be an age of giving much more power down to local areas, finding ways of developing industrial strategies which were much more flexible and intelligent and locally embedded, find ways of creating new political structures such as citizens' assemblies that give much more scope and say to people, ways of thinking about how you genuinely retrain for an uncertain world of AI, and how we ride through this era of technological change and the political threats that it poses, and find an ethical motivation to engage more in the world, not less. Reject the fantasies of nation building of the 2000s, but accept that the West can, if it is generous and courageous, still play a much more constructive role in ensuring a more stable, more democratic and prosperous world. Thank you.
Please.
Rory, it's Tony Hall, and it's lovely to listen to you and also to see you. I'm looking at a table with Union Jacks and also the EU flags on, and I wonder whether, thinking again in a decade, whether you could give us your view on how the relationship between the UK and the EU will develop over the coming decade. I hear people in your party, but also in the Labour Party, saying this will take generations, 2 generations, to get really, really close or even back into membership of the EU. What's your view?
So I think first thing to bear in mind is that there is an increasing support for EU membership. And it's very interesting that no political party is prepared to tap that. That Keir Starmer doesn't want to touch it, and that even the Lib Dems don't want to touch it. Because that reflects the fact that in the polls at the moment, the majority of people think we would have been better off remaining in the EU, but it's still only a minority of people that want to go through the pain of rejoining. I therefore think that in the short term, we should be pushing very hard to rejoin a customs union. I think that addresses many of the issues around the Northern Ireland border and will be vital for farming interests, industrial manufacturing interests, and allow us to get politically and economically much closer to the European Union without reopening the questions around free movement of people that created such challenges over the last few years. So I think customs union is a good start. I think to fully rejoin, the European Union itself would have to change. We'd have to end up with a world in which we had potentially a 2-speed Europe, potentially an outer circle, maybe of Scandinavian, Eastern European countries, which were less closely embedded in the project of a closer union, which Britain could dock with more comfortably.
I should add, Rory, that in the audience here there are many good people from the EU, and one lady who I much enjoyed talking to from Norway, who of course has their own view of the EU, which is not exactly on all fours. So they'll be very interested in what you've got to say.
I also need to say hello to Tony Hall. I wasn't gracious enough to an old friend who very kindly asked a question.
You've got a
So,
microphone.
hello, Tony.
Hello, thank you very much, Rory, and we shall read your book.
Please do.
Personally, I wish you were more in the forefront of politics, but to hear that from 2019 to 2023, the UK is contributing 1/8 of the amount to support Africa. And to take Tony Hall's point about joining the EU, to listen to the wonderful academic work that's being done in Oxford on AI, to know, having in my work experience, traveling to Taipei, where in the 80s, and you were talking about your first stage, where the UK was financially much in a stronger position, to know that the next general election is around the corner, and one of the big questions is the economy. The rest of the world, India no less, is on a march to become economically so much stronger. And I don't want the next decade to be the decade of despair. And I put a question to the MP who spoke very well earlier on this morning about who in the cabinet, who in the British government is not only reaching out to Europe, but is thinking of all the topics that we've heard this morning. Who is thinking about how we can become financially stronger and use our intelligence here to reach out to the rest of the world? It's a huge question. I'm not asking you to do it independently on your own, but I know you'll need help.
Rory, I should add, is well placed to answer about Africa because he's spent time on it.
Yes. Thank you. Just taking
well,
in the round everything
maybe
we've heard
rather
this
than
morning,
taking
where do we
the
go from here?
Rather than taking the grander question, I think the let's sort of maybe focus more on the niche question of Africa. We are in a very, very difficult situation there. You know, 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria by 2050. 40% of the global population will be in sub-Saharan Africa by the end of the century. And in the earlier part of my period, 90s, 2000s, we were very much in an age of optimism about Africa. Remember, front covers The Economist heralding an African century. And what we've seen last week in Gabon is particularly disturbing. You know, there was a narrative that was spreading that democracies were collapsing, military coups were taking over because these were countries on the edge of the Sahel. These were countries on the edge of the Sahara Desert, in fact, with conflicts between nomadic pastoralists and settled populations, profoundly affected by climate change, with very difficult demographic statistics. Niger, for example, where the average family size is 7.5 children. Areas that were plagued by terrorist insurgency, in particular organizations like ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda. But suddenly now we've had a coup d'etat in Gabon, which is one of the wealthiest countries in sub-Saharan Africa with a small population that isn't facing those issues of climate change in the same way, doesn't have the same demographic pressures. So it really is deeply, deeply disturbing and raises huge questions about where this is going to happen next. What should Britain be doing? Well, Britain should be not trying to imitate the United States by leaning further into Asia. It should be continuing to develop relationships and investments closer at home. It could be doing far more with international development. I was the Secretary of State for International Development. There are 1 or 2 incredibly straightforward things we could be doing to transform our development budget, transform the impact that we are having on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. But for any of these things to be achievable, we need a political system that is interested in thinking about foreign policy. And the truth of the matter is that the Foreign Office has been hollowed out over 30 years. Politicians are not really rewarded for thinking deeply about foreign policy. In fact, I was struck when I was a young MP, read about this in Politics on the Edge, that the biggest foreign policy debates of my time were empty. People didn't bother to turn up. Very few questions, and Prime Minister's questions are serious questions about foreign policy. Foreign Affairs Committee isn't very expert. And the British system remains very allergic to outside input. Unlike the US, where I felt, as a professor at Harvard or teaching at Yale, or even with journalists, the State Department, CIA were incredibly open to bringing people in and to outside ideas. The British system remains rigid, often amateur, and often underinvested on foreign policy.
All too true, I fear. Next question.
Simon Card. Rory, apart from a plea that we have our next seminar be a Rory Stewart seminar, can I just say one question? And that is that some years ago I worked for BT, and I took senior customers to BT laboratories, and one banker asked our chief technical officer there, what's the future of all this technology stuff and internet stuff? And Peter Cochrane said, I have absolutely no idea. And he was at the forefront of developing all this stuff. I have real concerns about social media. We've talked about it today. You've talked about it in your age of uncertainty. Where do we go with social media? What can we do about it? It's a real concern.
Social media is a really big problem. And the reason it's a big problem is that the algorithms, the way in which Twitter and Facebook is set up, is designed to amplify extreme commentary. So the reason why, if I were to send out a tweet on this phone, I've got 550,000 Twitter followers, and I was to send out a tweet saying, had rather an interesting conversation, with a group in Oxford about the structure of British foreign policy in Africa, I would get 5 likes. If I were to send out a tweet saying, Boris Johnson should be carted off to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, I would immediately get 15,000 likes and 5,000 retweets. And that is because they promote those comments. They deliberately push into feeds the most extreme comments that they can. So the first thing is that actually regulation should force these companies not to have algorithms that reinforce the extremes. You can set these algorithms in a different way to amplify consensus rather than dissension. I think the second thing is that we need to regulate AI very quickly. I mean, your point about somebody saying they didn't know where the internet was going. I mean, I think this is critical for us at the moment. We don't know where AI is going, but it is so astonishingly more powerful than anybody understands. People who are not using the advanced models are completely underestimating where we've got to. I was in a conversation recently with a very distinguished British scientist, Nobel Prize winner and knight, who said to me, oh, no, I don't think there's any reason to be worried about AI. I know about all this stuff. It should just be called machine learning. I don't think we're going to see much change there. And I'm afraid the truth is that he's not spending enough time with the advanced models. He doesn't understand just how radically transformational this is already, and how when they've spent another $1 billion on developing a model which will be inevitably next time 100 times more powerful, we're going to find ourselves in a totally different world. And that needs to be regulated now, because we are just about still at a stage where there are only 4 companies in the world that are able to build the large language models. Pretty soon, this technology is going to be diffusing to China, Dubai, and any number of actors that want to start producing their own LLMs on the cheap and their own national proprietary systems. So I think get involved in it now, regulate the transfer of technology, put the guardrails in place, get into the details of these things. And here I want to pay a bit of tribute to the European Union, which is often regarded as a bit of a stick in the mud. The most intelligent, thoughtful attempts to think about regulating AI at the moment are coming out of the EU. And you can feel that because a lot of the billionaires in Silicon Valley are becoming very anti-EU. That's usually a sign the EU is doing its job.
Well, I think Lord Hall will have been taking careful note of what you've just said, because it's been right, right within his own responsibilities, and indeed the session which took place before we were called away by a fire alarm. Yes, gentleman at the back there.
Hello, I'm Tomi Huhtanen. I'm an executive director of Martin Centers, one of the partners also behind this event. Thank you for excellent speech. You made reference already to several times to UK foreign policy, and also you mentioned Brexit. So as well, obviously, I'm from outside UK. So I would like to make a question. So how? Okay, last 3-4 years, many things has happened. COVID, war in Ukraine, etc., etc. But I would be interested to hear, how do you see this UK's foreign policy? How has it changed since Brexit? Maybe nothing at all, or the other global changes are so much dominating that you cannot not even see much what impact it has had. And do you feel that UK has now kind of found its place in the global scene, its position, or it had no impact? I would be interested to hear.
I think we had a very, very unfortunate series of foreign secretaries. I think the British government is beginning to find its feet a little bit more. But the problem is that it is in a fight with a populist, isolationist fringe of the Conservative Party, which is not prepared to spend money on international development or on diplomacy. So I think the current Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is doing a good job. I think he communicates very naturally. I think he forms warm relationships with people. I think he has a decent top team around him. But FCDO is heavily demoralized by some extremely unnecessary radical internal reforms that they've barely digested. Britain has played a clear, consistent, strong role in allying with Ukraine against Russia. And I think it's true that Boris Johnson's government developed a clear agenda there, and people understood where Britain stood and on whose side they were, and they acted quickly. But beyond that particular engagement, what are the successes? Well, many of the successes are simply undoing the damage that Boris Johnson's version of Brexit inflicted. So one great success of Rishi Sunak was, of course, the resolution of the problems in Northern Ireland, Sunningdale Agreement. Another success, of course, yesterday was rejoining Horizon. But these are, and you know, I want to pay credit to the fact that Rishi Sunak is doing the right thing. I mean, there were elements in his party that wouldn't want to do either of those things. I would underestimate the fights he would have had to get those things done. But we are a very, very long way from having a really thoughtful policy towards Africa, the Middle East, or Asia at the moment. And I would love to see the return to the national security strategy, developing a properly resourced strategy for those areas.
Alex Gunter from the Conservative European Forum. Rory, a big issue that you've mentioned repetitively is populism, and you've mentioned that we are going through ages, and populism has been a huge feature of this most recent age that we're in. I wondered what you think the future of populism is going to be. Is it going to just disappear naturally and be replaced by something else that's equally as important and dominating in our politics? Is it going to stay and continue to be a thorn? Or is there maybe something that the liberal centre, as you describe it, can do to get rid of populism and move forward towards your more ideal, decentralised, better age?
I think this is the big challenge. I think not to underestimate populism or its threat. There is a significant possibility that Donald Trump will win in the United States, that Macron will win in France, that the Conservative Party, after Rishi Sunak's defeat, will lurch back to being led by Suella Braverman. And I think Modi's not going anywhere soon. And that's very sad, the largest democracy in the world. And I think the rise of populist far-right parties in Europe is deeply disturbing. How do you respond? Well, you need to respond, if I can be cheeky and take Aristotle, you need to respond with the three things that Aristotle thinks matters in political communication. The first of those is the idea of pathos, emotion. So we need to find a way of not sounding in the center as though we're just dry technocrats reciting policy papers from Sweden, but we're putting a bit of oomph and emotion into our political communications again. Secondly, he talks about ethos or character. There needs to be a strong moral character. We need to have a moral purpose again, not just be technocrats, but actually explain that the problem with the populists is they're not just incompetent governments, but actually there is often something morally wrong with the way that they erode our institutions, their own personal conduct and corruption. But perhaps most importantly of all is what he calls logos. And logos is the thought. We need new ideas. We need to be able to say that we're not just going to go back to the 1990s. I mean, the populists are a revolutionary movement. You can't deal with them by just recreating the ancien regime that they existed to tear down. So we have to acknowledge how much went wrong in the 90s, how much we got wrong about economics and politics and international relations. And we need to craft a clear, compelling, exciting vision. The awful truth is that if I were to ask this audience to stick their hands up on who they thought would be the next prime minister, almost all of you would say Keir Starmer. And if I was then to ask you, which of you is brave enough to stick your hands up and tell me what Keir Starmer's economic policy was, not a single one of you would stick your hands up. So the only chance of defeating populism is to have that emotion, have the moral purpose, and have the clear ideas clearly articulated. And if we're lucky, occasionally with a bit of a sense of humor. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rory. Any more questions? Please. Are you rushing off to pack your bags? Rory?
John Pears. Quick question.
I think probably this should be the last question. Last question, yeah.
For someone who is a member of the Conservative Party but wouldn't dream of voting Conservative, what hope can you give us for some sort of progress? I know you've done various things.
Thank you. Well, I think if it's all right, Michael, I'll take this as the last question. And I think it's a really important question because what seems to have happened is that the right around the world has ceased to be conservative. Now, I was a conservative of a sort of one nation-y sort. I suppose the point would be that people like me call ourselves one nation conservatives and our opponents would call us Wets. But the basic idea of the kind of conservatism that I believed in is about respect for tradition, love of country, prudence at home, restraint abroad. I'm a Tory. I mean, I think if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that there's a lot that's very precious about the fabric of our constitution, our country, that we should be doubtful about radical schemes of change. And that kind of conservatism has been rejected by the right. You know, we found in Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party somebody who was prepared to lie to the Queen in order to prorogue Parliament, was then prepared to publicly attack the Supreme Court when they challenged his decision on proroguing Parliament, threw 21 members of his own party out of Parliament, including myself, but also including Winston Churchill's grandson, who, when he broke the ministerial code, our Prime Minister tried to rewrite the ministerial code so he no longer have to resign for breaking it, etc., etc., etc. And this isn't conservative. I mean, it's even worse in Israel. I mean, if you look at what the right is doing there, Benjamin Netanyahu is essentially tearing up every element of the unwritten constitution, all the constraints that existed. It's the same, of course, for Donald Trump, who shows no respect for the rule of law, which is meant to be one of the things that we in the Conservative Party were meant to be misty-eyed about, things like parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. So it's a terrible, terrible falling away. And the question is, can we re-energize conservatism, or have we entered an age of such radical, rocking modernity that the liberal progressives on the left are forced to be the people rather uncomfortably standing up for conserving things that are precious in the wake of irresponsible, reckless, populist, pseudo-revolutionary change? Thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye.
Right. Thank you very much. And can I just say to you all, thank you for your own hugely varied questions, and I've listened very carefully to the responses. Rory, I'd like to congratulate you for all you've said. My own thing that sticks in my own mind is your belief that in all the difficulties of everyday life in the world and in politics, if you're going to really live with yourself, you have to realize that there should be a moral purpose in it. And I do fully support that. I have no idea, perhaps you have no idea, where you are going to go to beyond politics on the edge. But I think that, as you already know from so many people in the UK, the country is crying out for people who can make the kind of contribution which your own makeup and experience can make. So please stick with whatever form of politics you go to, whether it's on the edge or not. Can I ask you all to applaud Rory for his contribution?
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And my last word is, I'd be surprised if it happened, but I firmly believe that after the United States, we can expect to see you in the UK in October. And if, which I doubt, if you have any time at all, I'd love to see you face to face rather than behind your screen. Thank you very much indeed.
That's the promise, Michael. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.